Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the US Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon of Sunday, May 5th, 2024. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the US Transhumanist Party. And today we have a fascinating conversation for you about transhumanism, objectivism, and the fight against disease. We are joined by our panel of U.S. Transhumanist Party officers, including Art Ramon Garcia, our Director of Visual Art, Jason Geringer, our Legislative Director, and Daniel Tweed, our 2024 U.S. Vice Presidential Candidate, and our Director of Citizen and Community Science. And our special guest for today is Ben Murnane. Ben is a published author. He is quite an eloquent and articulate writer, and he has written 3 books that we are going to discuss in some depth today. 2 in a Million, a true story about illness and love, Ayn Rand and the Posthuman, the mind-made future, and forthcoming on July 1st of this year, Transhuman Citizen, Zoltan Istvan's Hunt for Immortality. And all 3 of these books can be found online. So Ayn Rand and the Posthuman can be found on Amazon. And you can also get a preview of that book on Google Books. Google Books does not have the entirety of the content of that book, but it does have some notable excerpts. You can pre-order Transhuman Citizen on Amazon. Here is the link for that book. And Ben Murnane's book, 2 in a Million, a story of love and illness, can be found on his own website. So thank you, Ben, for joining us today. And tell us a bit more about these works, what inspired you to become a writer and author these books, and the connections you see among the ideas that you feature in them.
Thanks so much, Gennady. It's a pleasure to be here. I believe my camera is not working. I seem to be frozen, but you guys can hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm so sorry about that. I think it may be something to do with Google. I don't know. My camera seems to not work with Google Meet, so I don't know. But I guess we'll just go ahead. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay.
Yes, indeed.
Great. Well, yeah, so my first book was 2 in a Million, and that came out in 2008. And that was about, as you mentioned, Gennady, my struggle growing up with a very rare disease called Fanconi anemia, which is a genetic illness, and it only affects about 2 people in every million, and hence the title of the book. So I grew up in Ireland. I'm Irish. I'm living in Canada at the moment. My wife's Canadian, but I grew up in the Irish health system, and the book is about, I guess, growing up with this rare disease. It being unusual, I was the first person in Ireland to have a particular type of bone marrow transplant, which was a very new treatment at the time. And the book, I guess, was written after I'd emerged from hospital, after the transplant. Writing was a way that helped me to survive, I guess, and to kind of protect my brain and my thinking amidst all the things that were happening to my body. And after 2 in a Million came out, I wanted to write more books. And I was also interested in the intersections, I suppose, between illness and science. And that obviously led to an interest in transhumanism and the cutting edge of longevity science. I grew up with this disease that kills a lot of kids. The average life expectancy when I was coming of age was 22 years of age. It's since got a lot longer. I think it was 33 last time I checked. People do live beyond that. A lot of people don't live out of their 30s and 40s, but people do now live into their 60s and so on, which is fantastic. But still, a lot of young people die too young. And so I was interested in the frontiers of science and how they might advance the lives of people like me and everyone in general. And that led me to do a PhD ultimately on transhumanism and on Ayn Rand, who I'd also come across in my work as a journalist in Dublin. And I was interested in her influence on Silicon Valley and on the technology sector in particular. And so I did my PhD on Ayn Rand and her influence in Silicon Valley and her influence on the cutting edge of technology and how that maybe feeds into transhumanism. And so the PhD was later published in the book you mentioned, Ayn Rand and the Posthuman, The Mind-Made Future. And through the course of writing that book and doing the PhD, I came across so many interesting things, including your own work, Gennady. The objectivist extropian synthesis, I think, was a big influence on how I put together my PhD and what I wrote in there. And I also came across Zoltan and his advocacy for transhumanism and for longer lives for all of us. And the final chapter of my thesis and of the book was on Zoltan's work and his novel, The Transhumanist Wager. Zoltan is very upfront about the fact that he was influenced in a major way by Ayn Rand. I think anyone who has read The Transhumanist Wager probably can see the similarities between it and Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead, Rand's two major novels. If you've read them, you know, you could probably see their traces in The Transhumanist Wager. And at the time, you know, when Zoltan launched the book and he did a lot of media interviews, he was very upfront about the fact that he was trying to write an Atlas Shrugged for the transhumanist movement and kind of Atlas Shrugged for a new generation. So that led to a sort of a friendship between myself and Zoltan, and he was interested in a biographer, someone to kind of talk about his journey and his advocacy and all the crazy things he's done, including setting up the US Transhumanist Party, right? Crazy like a fox, maybe, in terms of how he's approaching the future. And yeah, so that was my next book after the PhD book was published, Zoltan Istvan's Hunt for Immortality, Transhuman Citizen, and that is coming out later this year. So I'm excited for that.
Yes, thank you very much for that overview, Ben. And I am also looking forward to the release of Transhuman Citizen. Now, I'm curious, what in particular do you think allows so many people who are interested in objectivism and the thinking of Ayn Rand to also be more receptive to transhumanism and gravitate toward it? What are some of the similarities, some of the complementarities of the two? And of course, you mentioned my article from back in 2004, The Objectivist Extropian Synthesis, where I wrote about the similarities and the potential for integration of objectivism with the philosophy of extropy, which was based on Max More's writings. And at that time, it was essentially the most libertarian leaning strain of transhumanism. So what do you think, from your standpoint, the key similarities and affinities are?
Sure. Well, it's obviously a topic I got into quite in depth in the course of studying for the PhD and then putting together the book, Ayn Rand and the Posthuman. And I mean, obviously the key thing is an advocacy of technology, right? And I think Rand, you know, maybe alone among 20th century writers, apart from kind of science fiction writers, she was a big proponent of technology and its advancement and the progress of technology as being essential to what it means to be human. And she celebrates very overtly technological creation. I mean, in Atlas Shrugged in particular, obviously there are so many passages that celebrate kind of the unsung heroes that have created the modern world, the industrial titans. There's a fantastic passage about Rearden metal being created and the sort of beautiful sparks of metal dropping into this big pit. And, you know, it's just very unusual among writers to see that kind of celebration, I guess, of something that, you know, from a literary standpoint is, I think, not very interesting to many writers, or if they are interested in it, they think of it negatively in terms of how technology negatively affects the human condition and maybe takes us away from what's human. But for Rand, technology was essential to what it means to be human. That's how we survive, right? That's how we, among all the animals on the planet, function. We build things, we change our environment, we adapt, we improve, we progress. And technology is the key means through how we do that. And we learn from one generation to the next. So, you know, we evolve from the hut to the house to the skyscraper to the moon rocket, right? And that was key to how Ayn Rand, I think, saw human progress and saw that as a very, very good thing. And obviously, for her, it was all bound up in her advocacy of the individual mind, the individual being the primary creator, the primary pusher forward of technological progress, and also her advocacy of capitalism, right? Capitalism as a creative arena in which things like Silicon Valley happen. And that's unique, I think, in the humanities, unique for a novelist. You don't see that kind of thing being celebrated and put forth in fiction that often. So to me, it's kind of a no-brainer, or at least it was when I began to study it. It, of course, made sense that so many Silicon Valley entrepreneurs were inspired by the vision of individualism in The Fountainhead and the vision of creative capitalism in Atlas Shrugged. Of course, it made sense that you would want to start a company and that you would want to do things that had never been done before, and that you would want to push forward the human condition. And so to me, that's the key link, right? The key link between Rand and transhumanism is both see technology not as an ill, not as something that takes away from what's human, but what pushes forward the human condition and what allows us to transcend each generation upon the next.
Yes, indeed. And thank you for those insights. And I too was attracted to Ayn Rand's writing to a great extent because she advocated for technological progress and the role of the productive human mind, the role of the individualist creator in bringing this about. And even when I was much younger, I sensed that there was a kind of looming stagnation coming over parts of our society, even if one acknowledges the tremendous progress that has been made in the world of bits with advances in computers and subsequent to my writings on objectivism in the realm of mobile phones, for example, or artificial intelligence, it remains the case that in the world of atoms, progress has been hamstrung by a variety of forces and by a culture that has increasingly departed from this recognition of the vital role of the individualist creator. And yet you mentioned that many key figures who ended up being major influences for our era and the immediately preceding era were inspired by Ayn Rand. So to what extent do you think the ideas of objectivism have actually succeeded or have been embedded in our society during the present era? Or do you think there's still essentially a minority set of ideas, perhaps contending to become more influential, but definitely not the mainstream yet?
It's such an interesting point and such an interesting question. And it's something I got into, again, quite deeply in the course of studying for the PhD and writing the book afterward. I think it depends on how you look at it. and it depends on what you analyze. And I think both answers can be true. I think on the one hand, Ayn Rand, I think, has had a massive influence both on the political sphere and on the technological sphere, and in many ways is one of the people responsible for the culture we've had today, or the culture we've had over the course of the past 40 years, maybe since the 80s. I think if, and this is what a lot of left-wing critics of Rand in particular say, right? Ayn Rand is responsible for neoliberalism. Ayn Rand responsible for the market crash in 2008, because it's all to do with kind of people in the Reagan administration like Alan Greenspan and others who were acolytes of Ayn Rand and fans of her work, and then got into government and in some way maybe attempted to put the philosophy of objectivism into practice. So you can say that. Now, objectivists would say, no, 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 nobody has ever really tried to put objectivism qua objectivism into practice. Objectivism being obviously Rand's philosophy as put forward in The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged and her subsequent nonfiction writings, a philosophy of the morality of capitalism, essentially. So I think, like I say, both things are true. I think, if you study Rand qua Rand, there's no doubt she is one of the most influential figures in modern history, and often unacknowledged as such. Yes, because she influenced people like Alan Greenspan, who then went on to have a massive impact on our financial sphere, because she influenced Reaganite policies in the 80s, which created the kind of Cold War and post-Cold War economy. So yes, because of that, but also because of the other side, which we began with, which is her influence in Silicon Valley and her influence among entrepreneurs and her inspiration, the inspiration that she provided to people like Steve Jobs and Jimmy Wales and, so many people, even Mark Cuban, who acknowledged that reading Rand really pushed them forward and gave them a vision of maybe how they wanted the world to be, who they wanted themselves to be. So I think she, among fiction writers, and this was what was so interesting to me doing the PhD and the book, I was interested because I'm a literary person. Essentially, I'm a writer. I'm a humanities scholar, by training and trade. And I was interested in, how does fiction impact the real world? How does fiction impact real life? And I think maybe alone among fiction writers, Rand stands out as having so much influence on the real economy, on the real development of technology. So yes, objectivism has come true, quote unquote, in that way, but it isn't true in our hearts. In the hearts and the minds of the culture, we're still very much hamstrung, at least in the minds of objectivists, in terms of our morality and our approach to life. So there are the facts of technology progressing. There are the facts of the economy developing as it has and capitalism developing as it has. But we're always fighting against that. There's a huge element of the culture that obviously is fighting against the fact that there's still inequality, is fighting against the idea that technological progress is good. And obviously, from a hardcore objectivist point of view, real objectivism has never been tried. We've never kind of dealt with each other without altruism being kind of the primary moral condition in which we find ourselves embedded. And we could get into why that's the case. A lot of it has to do with the religious nature of the culture, probably. So I think, just to summarize, I think both things are true. I think on the one hand, Rand has had a massive influence on how things actually are today. But on the other hand, we still are not in an objectivist culture by any means in terms of what we think is good and what we think is right.
Yes, and I would agree, we're definitely not in an objectivist culture. Certainly there are organizations that have had some degree of influence. The Atlas Society is, I think, the most influential objectivist organization right now, followed by the Ayn Rand Institute. The Ayn Rand Institute cleaves more closely to what they consider to be strict objectivism, and they don't really like any sort of departure from Ayn Rand's writing, whereas the Atlas Society is more open to engaging other thinkers and perhaps extending Ayn Rand's philosophy. Then there's a publication called The Objective Standard. I used to be involved with an online community called the Rebirth of Reason, and of course my own online magazine, The Rational Argumentator, which I started in 2002, was heavily influenced by objectivism, especially at the beginning. Now, as I continued my involvement in the objectivist community in the early to mid 2000s, I realized that there were some internal obstacles to objectivism becoming a more widespread cultural phenomenon. And that is, the objectivists very often turned on one another, and they very often accused other objectivists or aligned individuals of being insufficiently pure. And there were, of course, even going back to Ayn Rand's time, a series of purges, excommunications, denunciations. People were kind of nitpicking one another's views. And that caused, in my view, the objectivist movement to stagnate and to really limit its own influence on the broader culture, because so many objectivists were obsessed with these questions of purity instead of looking outward and advocating for the ideas of objectivism in whatever format they themselves adhered to them or thought that they could be influential. Because at that time, my view was any sort of influence of that sort would be beneficial on the broader culture. But here is this movement shooting itself in the foot. And that actually gave me a bit of a preview in the early to mid 2000s of social media culture more generally, in the wake of the arrival of the social media platforms, where people kind of sorted themselves into these filter bubbles, these online communities, where they were increasingly associating with people who were quite like themselves ideologically, but they kind of lacked this reality check that most people in the general culture didn't think that way, and they should really treat the people who had some sort of affinity to them as allies rather than nitpicking the differences. So that taught me a lot about how the transhumanist movement ought to present itself, and really formed the basis of the big tent approach with which I run the Transhumanist Party. But certainly Zoltan himself was highly influenced by objectivism, and this book, The Transhumanist Wager, which we discussed, actually usually resides on that bookshelf behind me with various other works that I consider particularly influential. And these blue and gold bound tomes that you see behind me are respectively We the Living, Anthem, The Fountainhead, and Atlas Shrugged. And then I have Ludwig von Mises's Human Action. I have Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. I have Frédéric Bastiat's The Law. I have various books in which my essays have been published, but I also have The Transhumanist Wager because it truly was an inspiration for me. And it wasn't the kind of inspiration where I picked up the book and I said, yes, I enthusiastically agree with everything that Zoltan wrote. In fact, when I first reviewed The Transhumanist Wager in 2013, now 11 years ago, I had some critiques. And my critiques were in contrast to Atlas Shrugged. So I explicitly compared and contrasted Jethro Knight's philosophy of teleological egocentric functionalism with Ayn Rand's objectivism. And I pointed out that there are certain behaviors that Jethro Knight engages in that Ayn Rand's characters would not dare to go to those lengths in order to, for instance, pursue their own interests or their own power. Ayn Rand's characters, to some extent, consider themselves to be more restrained by the rights of others, for example, or a kind of broader humanism that perhaps Jethro Knight's does not quite adhere to. But Zoltan read my review and he thought that this was a rigorous and accurate analysis of his book, even the parts of it that were critiques, because I pointed out to some extent the transhumanist wager is a cautionary tale, where the struggle between the transhumanists and the reactionaries, the Christian fundamentalists in his book, is a struggle that we should seek to avoid, that we shouldn't let the conflict in society devolve to that point, that we should try to find a peaceful path toward a transhumanist future and bring the rest of society along with us. So I'm wondering, when you read The Transhumanist Wager, what were your thoughts about its relationship to Ayn Rand's novels? There is clearly an influence and there are clearly some differences, but what went on in your mind as you read that book, and what were some reactions that you had to it?
Sure. Yeah. And it's so interesting to hear your thoughts, Gennady. And obviously, I've got into this quite a bit with Zoltan, and I have problems with the transhumanist wager. And I've, been upfront about those in my book, which is forthcoming. So it's interesting because when I first read the transhumanist wager, I was in the middle of my PhD, right? So I was most familiar with The Fountainhead and with Atlas Shrugged. And so there wasn't any other way for me to read it other than this guy's just ripping off Atlas Shrugged, or this guy's just ripping off The Fountainhead. That's how it came across to me. But what was interesting was how he took those. I mean, it's very obvious to me, and I talk about this in Transhuman Citizen. It's just very obvious that Zoltan was A, very inspired by Rand, and B, copied her ideas for how to create a plot, for how to create character dynamics. And that was very evident when I first read The Transhumanist Wager. Now, that's one thing. The second thing, which you also spoke about there, Gennady, is Zoltan augments that with a very different approach philosophically in terms of how we should influence a culture or how we should change the world. And so that was interesting when I was reading it. I think slightly terrifying was my first reaction to how Zoltan presents the kind of conflict between the transhumanists and the rest of the world, if we want to put it that way, how he sees that conflict or how he saw it when he put together The Transhumanist Wager. And I would agree with you. I think probably a broader church approach is, certainly A, the more ethical thing, and B, probably more likely ultimately to be more effective and better for the vast majority of people on planet Earth. Now, whether we can get to a kind of a transhumanist future without a sort of a Zoltan moment, I don't know, but I think it's certainly, the more ethical approach would be not to go the Jethro Knight's way, with the Jethro Knight's way being, not to see other people as deserving of rights necessarily in and of themselves, to see other people essentially the way Rand views nature. So like Rand views nature as to be adapted and put to human use essentially. And Zoltan kind of extended that in The Transhumanist Wager to other people. So other people should be vehicles for us to extend our will and not necessarily entities in and of themselves. And I think that is obviously morally wrong from my point of view. So, so what was my view on the book vis-a-vis Rand? On the one hand, it was obvious that Zoltan had been inspired by and taken Rand's ideas and applied them to his own philosophy. I think I would be more in there with the objectivists and with you, Gennady, in terms of saying Zoltan's is the wrong approach or Jethro's is the wrong approach. A, I don't think it's likely to work, and B, it's just wrong on the face of it. And so, I would hold to the traditional libertarian view that, your rights end where somebody else's body begins for the most part. And I think That's not something that Jethro adheres to, and so that's very problematic.
Yes, indeed. And I think Zoltan has said throughout the years that he sees Jethro as a character in a book. He doesn't consider Jethro to be a role model or a reflection of what Zoltan himself would do. And if you read Zoltan's subsequent articles, which of course you have done, then he lays out a very different vision for policies and programs that I do think are, on the whole, more rights respecting, though I've had issues with some of his proposals as well. And I think the US Transhumanist Party platform today reflects some differences, particularly in terms of how it respects individual privacy and essentially the freedom to make decisions about which aspects of one's data and one's personal life are disclosed to others. But Zoltan does have a broadly libertarian ethos, and this was the reason why I think he was receptive to my critique in my review. Now, one unifying aspect of transhumanism and objectivism that our friend Alan Crowley pointed out is human control of human destiny. And it seems that this is really where Zoltan took the inspiration from Ayn Rand and created a work that was in a very similar style. Indeed, one reason why I found that it was a page turner is that it harkened back to my days of reading Ayn Rand's novels. And I do find that Zoltan was able to capture a lot of those elements in terms of the plot, in terms of the integration of philosophy and ideas into a fictional narrative that made one want to keep reading and that made one want to see where these characters would take these ideas. But as I've said before, I do consider Jethro to be a cautionary tale. And of course, then Zoltan went on to try to implement his political vision rather than Jethro's political vision in the form of the Transhumanist Party and the Immortality bus tour. So perhaps it would be interesting to hear your commentary on where you think the Transhumanist Party aligned with or departed from the transhumanist wager, and how you think it has evolved over time from Zoltan's day to the present, where, of course, I'm the chairman of the Transhumanist Party. We hold these virtual Enlightenment salons, but I do have a bit of a different approach than Zoltan had, and I know you think it's almost a diametrically opposite approach. So I would be interested in your thoughts on the practical aspects of the transhumanist movement since the publication of the Transhumanist Wager.
Sure, yeah. And this is a topic I think you and I have corresponded on previously, Gennady, as well. And yeah, you're right, of course, that Zoltan is not Jethro. And that's one of the kind of themes in Transhuman Citizen is, you know, to what extent is Zoltan Jethro and to what extent is he not Jethro? Because at times he is and he wants to be, and he wants to kind of remind himself that, you know, we're here to change the world, whatever it takes. And at other times he is more himself, I suppose, and more traditionally libertarian in terms of, you know, don't tread on me. And I think that's a struggle within him that he also goes back and forth on. And to me, that's what makes him an interesting person, an interesting character. It's one of the things that drew me to writing about him. And so, yes, when he started the Transhumanist Party, I think, so, I mean, to take a step back, Zoltan is very upfront about the fact that he wants everybody to live forever, whatever it takes, and through however that can come about, right? And so that's his North Star, that's his guiding principle. And how that gets done, I don't think he is too ideological in terms of how we get there. That could be companies making it happen. It could be the government making it happen. And he doesn't really mind which path we take as long as we get there and get there as quickly as possible. And I know part of then what drove him in terms of his advocacy of transhumanism and setting up the Transhumanist Party was, we need to change the culture. We need to influence people. We need to beam the word transhumanism into as many homes as possible across the world. And he saw politics as one means of doing that, and the Transhumanist Party as a means of doing that, and as a means essentially of getting media attention, which is always a big thing with Zoltan. And he's good at it. He's good at kind of creating outlandish narratives and doing stunts, as he would describe them himself, creating a circus, which does get mainstream media attention, right? And the bus tour is kind of the sine qua non of that, the apotheosis of that. Driving this coffin-shaped bus all over the US and going to biohacker festivals and meeting with John McAfee and doing all these crazy things, infiltrating a mega church and handing out atheist pamphlets. These are the kinds of things that the mainstream media will jump on potentially, and at least run it as a side story, right? It's quirky, it's interesting, it's human interest, it's it grabs headlines, right? And that's a key factor of what Zoltan wants to do. He wants to get media attention. He wants to beam the word transhumanism into people's homes. Now, there's a counterpoint to that, which is, well, is it really worth it just having people hear about transhumanism if they're going to associate transhumanism with crazy stuff or things that shouldn't be happening, or, outlandish stunts? They're just going to associate transhumanism with crazy fringe people, right? And not with a mainstream movement. And I think that led a lot of the backlash to a lot of Zoltan's activities, particularly in the early days when he was setting up the party and when he was doing the bus tour. And, certain people saying, well, if this is what transhumanism becomes associated with, I don't want to be a transhumanist, right? Because this doesn't represent me. And I think that's a legitimate argument. So I think then there's the other approach, which is, it's more important that we develop ourselves as a transhumanist movement that has integrity, that stands for something that, as you alluded to, Gennady, is a broad church that doesn't shut people out, that is not just for atheists, for example, and that kind of developing ourselves as a serious movement is more important than grabbing headlines, because who knows what those headlines will be about. And I think both are legitimate. Like, as me as an outsider, I can see merits in both approaches in terms of advocating for transhumanism. I think, sure, you want headlines, you want media attention, and things even that might seem crazy on the surface. Maybe you reach one person and, they think more deeply about stuff, and certainly you can change the culture that way, even by approaching things from the fringe. But I also think it's perfectly legitimate and valid to, want to be more inclusive, to not want to just be grabbing headlines, to develop a movement kind of from the ground up rather than from the top down in terms of grabbing headlines. So to me, that's what I would see as the key difference in approach. And I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, Gennady, because you're the one who's actually doing it. But to me, that's the key difference. Is Zoltan was all about headlines, is always about headlines, is always about getting the attention, however it can be done. And you, from what I've seen, are more interested in developing the movement across all its facets. And I think you've said before, when the culture implodes, if and when that happens, we'll be there as a serious alternative, because we have developed ourselves as a serious alternative with policies and, a certain approach to how we do things. So I think both are equally valid. I could see the merits of both, but it is definitely a different approach.
Yes, indeed. And I think your analysis is quite insightful here and quite accurate in many respects. I do see it as essential to build up the movement and to be prepared to essentially engage in key decisions within the culture, within the society, within politics when mainstream systems clearly show themselves to be inadequate to the task, as I think they are already showing themselves to be, but many people are still acquiescing to them by default because they haven't found good alternatives. And the transhumanist movement itself is not yet large enough and not yet vocal enough to really reach the numbers of people that we need to reach. But we are working on it. And I think the key is to have very effective infrastructure within the movement and dedicated people, of course, who can undertake the day-to-day tasks, which are sometimes unseen and unrecognized, but they're essential in enabling any organization, any movement to operate in a coordinated fashion and an outward-looking fashion. So I have done a lot of work in communicating internally within the movement and reconciling certain differences, making transhumanists of various persuasions, various intellectual backgrounds, other philosophies and worldviews consider themselves to be included, to be heard, and to be participants in this conversation, because I think their efforts could be quite helpful in building this movement. One insight that I have is any movement that grows sufficiently large cannot just be limited to one brand or one flavor. There would just be too many differences in personal views. And yet, there would also be enough people who are sufficiently aligned with it that they could do a lot of good. So we should try to encourage that. And I have tried to form connections, alliances with transhumanists outside the US Transhumanist Party, or people who might not call themselves transhumanists quite, but who do value many of the same pursuits that we value and many of the same goals. And I would say I am a pragmatist in practice in terms of how I lead organizations. So even though I'm quite philosophically minded and I consider myself to be a person of high principle, in reality, in terms of how I approach people, what matters more to me is not what another person's ideology is, but what they are willing to do and how they're willing to interact with me and the organization that I lead, whether they're willing to collaborate, whether they're willing to have dialogue. And if they are, then that's great. And we can explore both our similarities and our differences and how we can help one another. Now, I think Zoltan himself is a genuinely nice human being. And
Yeah.
for many people, one of the contrasts would be between, say, the ideology of Jethro Knights and its perceived use of humans as instrumental, and Zoltan, the individual, who clearly treats people well. He treats people with respect. And I do think, in terms of his values, he would agree with the approach that I have articulated. But I think where he would disagree and where he would critique this approach is in terms of the relationship with the media. And of course, you've recognized that as well. I do not like sensationalism, and I do not like making statements just for the sake of attracting views or clicks. And I was actually fine with the Immortality bus campaign. I think it was creative, and I think it brought certain ideas to the forefront of the public imagination. So I don't want to criticize anything that Zoltan did in particular during his campaign, especially because in many ways I was quite vocally defending him when it came to the many detractors who, as you stated, wanted to distance transhumanism from Zoltan's approach. But I myself want to be very careful that anything we communicate to the media is very well supported, almost to the point of being boring, which, of course, is the paradox, because if you have something for which you can make a very solid case, chances are other people have recognized it already and have seen the effects of these technologies or these developments in their own lives. So that's kind of perhaps the irony of this approach. When in the Transhumanist Party we talk about the potential of future technologies, we still have the same goals in terms of indefinite life extension and other immense improvements to the human condition. But we point out examples of the pursuit of those goals and scientists who are working on them or other individuals who are advocating them in a way that I think a reasonable person listening to our conversations would say, yes, this makes sense. This is already happening, and it makes sense for it to continue to happen. But that's not something that the media are going to write headline stories about. And I understand that, and I see that limitation, and I do ponder about how we might overcome it. Now, another aspect that I think perhaps Zoltan doesn't quite see in the same way that I do is how the media landscape has shifted since Zoltan ran his campaign. Because in the mid 2010s, the media still had a bit of an affinity toward transhumanism. This was before the age of Donald Trump, before the rise of populism. And I think the media were willing to give alternative ideas or intellectual paradigms a fair hearing, and that included transhumanism. And that's why Zoltan's campaign was covered in the media, I would say, not always in a positive way, but in a way that gave it enough exposure. But since the rise of Donald Trump, I have seen a reaction in the mainstream media against anything that challenges essentially the pre-Trump political establishment. Because the mainstream media, on the one hand, really benefited from Trump and the views and clicks that Trump's rise attracted. Indeed, the now disgraced head of CBS, Les Moonves, in 2017 said, well, Donald Trump is bad for America, but he's really good for CBS. So in a cynical way, the mainstream media really recognized that. But a lot of people working for the mainstream media are hardline ideologues who dislike Trump so much that they think anything that is contrary to the establishment that Trump has challenged is a threat. And so they want to de-emphasize it. They don't hate transhumanism the way they hate Trump. They don't even hate libertarianism the way they hate Trump. But what they don't want to do anymore is give any alternative to the conventional Democratic Party agenda a hearing in the media, because they worry that people, especially voters, are going to find out about it and support that rather than the Democratic Party. And that would include people who don't like Trump. So unfortunately, it seems to me the media have become less open, less objective. This has been exacerbated by the COVID pandemic. And this is one reason why transhumanism is not getting as much airtime. And this might have happened even if Zoltan had stayed at the head of the Transhumanist Party. I don't know if Zoltan would have wanted to lead the same organization for 8 years in the way that I will have done by November of this year. I'm approaching 7.5 years of my tenure as chairman, and Zoltan was in that position for a little bit over 2 years. So I think perhaps Zoltan does not sufficiently appreciate how the media ecosystem has evolved. But I wonder what your thoughts are in response to that. And of course, you've had a lot of conversations with Zoltan about this, even more recently than I have. So I'm curious to hear your impressions and whether any of my comments resonate with you.
Sure. I mean, yeah, I would agree with that, broadly speaking, in the sense that I agree that the media is now less receptive to third party candidates in general, giving them coverage, wants to shut them down because, as you say, I think Trump exposed for a lot of people the potential existential threat that there is to the United States, at least in some people's minds, the threat to the establishment order. And there's a lot of rearguard defense in terms of trying to shore up the existing order. Whereas beforehand, it was fine to run stories about crazy campaigns and crazy candidates, and it didn't feel like it would be a threat to Clinton getting elected, for instance. But then we found out that, oh, people, did vote for third parties. And, maybe we don't want to include too much about that going forward in the media narrative. I would agree with that. I think Zoltan himself personally is aware of how the media landscape has changed. He has admitted to me, I think I said it in the book, it's difficult now to get the kind of attention, the kind of stories written that he would have got written about him back in the day in 2016. I think, yeah, there's the kind of fact that the media landscape has changed, as we've said. Also, just personality-wise, some of the people he's worked with have moved on, for example. And I think transhumanism and maybe what Zoltan represents politically are not the crazy new thing that they were and that were kind of exciting 8 years ago, right? And so now the coverage would tend to be a lot more critical, a lot more wanting to know, like, how does this actually play out? What are the policies? They're less willing to just kind of take and print whatever Zoltan might feed them, and I think he is aware of that. It's something he's come up against for sure. And I don't know what the answer to that is in terms of getting the message out there about transhumanism. I think there are definitely merits to the approach that you've taken, Gennady, in terms of representing a serious alternative and then, trying to go around the mainstream media because, there are so many other avenues to reach a potential audience now, for sure. So that is certainly one approach. I think there's also then just the question, and I would be interested in your take on this, the question of kind of transhumanism as a kind of a thing that may end, in the sense of, like, transhumanism advocates for human beings becoming more, living forever, becoming cyborgs. But in the sense, that may happen without transhumanism as a movement, right? And it may be 100, 200 years from now that we get to a point where, we have radically longer lives, and transhumanism has played a part in it, but the kind of word transhumanism is forgotten because it's just how we live in 200 or 300 years. And this, I think, is a point that the Ayn Rand folks make. Yaron Brook, chairman of the Ayn Rand Institute, he was asked a question once on his podcast about transhumanism, and he said, well, he didn't really see the point in a philosophy called transhumanism because it's just what the future is going to be if we continue to advocate for new technologies and continue to incorporate them into our lives. And to some extent, I think that is an approach that Zoltan has taken in terms of trying now to infiltrate, for want of a better word, more mainstream parties and, get a message about longer life and universal basic income even. He's less emphasizing the radical technological aspects of transhumanism and more emphasizing, I guess, just longevity and those aspects. So I guess that would be my question to put back at you. Is there a place still for transhumanism qua transhumanism, do you think? And obviously you would say yes, but I wonder what that place is. And do you acknowledge the point that, transhumanism may be forgotten in 500 years, even if we arrive at a transhumanist future?
Yes, and these are fascinating questions, to be sure. In terms of a place for transhumanism, of course, I would say there is one right now because the key goals of transhumanism have not been achieved yet. I would say we would need to have, at the very least, immense extension of the maximum human lifespan before we can say the goals of transhumanism have been achieved. When we've reached longevity, escape velocity, when we no longer have any sort of hard upper limit on our life expectancies, then I would say it may be possible to consider, well, have we passed through the transhuman era into something else? But while we live in this messy transitional period between postmodernity, which I would say largely transpired between about, let's say, 1945, the end of World War II, and 2017, perhaps the inauguration of Donald Trump, though some may say we're still in this postmodern paradigm, especially when it comes to the so-called post-truth paradigm. But nonetheless, transhumanism has not achieved its objectives yet. There are elements of it that are coming to be in the broader culture, but the explicit term transhumanism, in my view, is absolutely necessary to advocate not just for one strain of advancements such as longevity or automation or artificial intelligence or space travel, but a common theme that unites them all. And that is going beyond the historic limits of the human condition while still maintaining what is good about our humanity and augmenting it, enhancing it. So, in my view, that term is really beneficial as an encapsulation of this philosophy. And with all respect to your own book, I realize he's not an adversary in this respect. I think he does share a lot of the same goals. But I think he doesn't appreciate the big tent potential of transhumanism that objectivism, for example, does not have. Because, of course, Ayn Rand had a very specific philosophy, and I think it's a good philosophy, but many people, for instance, theists, are not going to become objectivists. At least they won't become objectivists in the same way that Rand is. They might adopt some aspects of rational individualism, perhaps capitalist politics, certainly some of Rand's aesthetics, but they're not going to be aligned with her from a metaphysical standpoint or an epistemological standpoint. So we need some broader term that can encompass these differences so that a Christian can be a transhumanist, a socialist can be a transhumanist, a libertarian can be a transhumanist, an objectivist can be a transhumanist, and they can all work together for a shared future and recognize some similarities. I'm not asking people to reject their worldviews, but for instance, if you're a socialist and you believe in the end goal that Karl Marx advocated, which is essentially a stateless society with universal abundance and prosperity for everybody, where people can work because they want to work, and they'll work in a variety of fields, and essentially they do it to better themselves, to better their society. I think that's a vision that's actually very much aligned with what some libertarians seek and what some objectivists seek and what many transhumanists seek. And I want people to recognize the term transhumanism as being a unifier in terms of these aspirations. Zoltan actually had some similar thoughts, and he mentioned the rise of environmentalism, how environmentalism started as a kind of radical fringe movement, but now many mainstream figures would call themselves environmentalists, and many people in the Democratic Party would say, well, I'm an environmentalist. Many people in the Republican Party would say, I'm an environmentalist. There are libertarian environmentalists too, who think that the environment can be protected based on more of a free market and private property oriented approach. So this is the kind of future that I would envision for transhumanism. I don't know if the Transhumanist Party can become one of the dominant political parties in the United States. I think there are some possible scenarios where that could happen if one or both of the existing parties implode and we are ready to fill the vacuum by that time. But I would be quite fine with a scenario where, say, in the year 2040, a Democratic Party candidate, if the Democratic Party survives, runs for president and says, I'm a Democratic transhumanist. Or if the Libertarian Party becomes more prominent and there's a transhumanist caucus within the Libertarian Party and various libertarians running for president say, I'm a libertarian transhumanist. I believe in the advancement of science and technology for the betterment of the human condition. Unfortunately, there are also significant reactionary strains within the Libertarian Party, people who are just anti-science to an absurd extent, and they think everything is a conspiracy to poison and brainwash and manipulate people. And that is definitely a strain of the current libertarian movement that I resoundingly reject. But I think that's the kind of future. I want transhumanism to be a term that transcends conventional affiliations and loyalties and political parties, and a term that becomes essentially universally recognized as good and worthwhile. Now, in terms of whether that term will be used in 500 years, it's interesting because transhumanism, it means going beyond the limitations of humanity, but the prefix trans can also mean through. So through our humanity, we accomplish these things. And in 500 years, could it be said that perhaps we've passed through a transitional stage and we are at a different stage? We are some sort of cosmic civilization now. I would hypothesize perhaps the civilization of that time might be referred to as a cosmopolity, from the term cosmopolitan. So it's a polity that encompasses essentially all the sentient beings that will be known at that time, and their diversity, which may extend well beyond the human, with artificial intelligence, with perhaps extraterrestrial beings if we encounter them, and our descendants who may be very different from us. So would the term transhumanism apply to that future cosmopolity, or whatever it might be called? That's an open question. I obviously cannot foresee fully the evolution of terminology over a 500-year time horizon. But there could be, in that era, scholars who look back and say, well, this was the transhuman era. The transhuman era happened, say, between 2028 and 2060 or something like that. Obviously, these are not precise dates, but I do think the transhuman era would be an era where this term transhumanism becomes mainstream and it is seen as a very active influence. So hopefully that gave you some insight into how I think about it, but I'm curious as to your reaction.
No, I agree. I think, yeah, it's hard to know how things may develop, but whether or not the word transhumanism is used in 500 years is not the important aspect, right? I think right now it says something, and it says something that's important in terms of what we would like to bring to the foreground in terms of values. And I think transhumanism has a lot going for it, as you alluded to, that objectivism doesn't, because objectivism necessarily, and this is kind of goes to the conflict between the Ayn Rand Institute and the Atlas Society. Like, the Ayn Rand Institute is of the view, which I think is probably the more accurate view, that objectivism is the philosophy of Ayn Rand. Objectivism is what Ayn Rand said in her novels and nonfiction. Therefore, nobody can add to that and call themselves an objectivist unless they're kind of just reiterating essentially what Ayn Rand said. Like, so, and the Atlas Society, and this goes back to a conflict with the Ayn Rand Institute in the 80s and all of those politics I won't go into, but, you know, the Atlas Society just defines itself as open objectivism, where other philosophies can, you know, add to what Ayn Rand said, and that is still within the corpus of objectivism, if you like. Whereas for the Ayn Rand Institute, it's not the case that Ayn Rand is eternal and got everything right necessarily, and that somebody may come along and, you know, say something that contradicts what Ayn Rand said but is now true. It's just that that isn't objectivism. Objectivism is only the corpus of Ayn Rand, according to the Ayn Rand Institute. So I think if you're defining yourself very narrowly the way objectivism officially does, you can't encompass the whole of humanity in a way that I think transhumanism can. And environmentalism is the apt comparison. As you said, Zoltan is a big advocate for the idea that transhumanism should take the path of environmentalism in terms of becoming normal within the lives of most people. on the planet, or certainly in the West, the way environmentalism has. So yeah, and there's a big section in the book, Transhuman Citizen, on how he kind of came to that view and what it might mean for the development of transhumanism. So yeah, so transhumanism is a much broader sphere, and it can be a much broader sphere. It doesn't just have to be atheists. It doesn't just have to be fans of Ayn Rand. It can be like environmentalism in terms of we can incorporate into our lives a view that we want to live much longer and that technology is good. And that's transhumanism. And that can be applied to any other aspect of our outlook on life, whether that's socialism, whether that's libertarianism, whether that's an advocacy of capitalism. And so, yeah, I think that is the one big advantage that transhumanism has over a narrower philosophy like objectivism. And I would certainly be encouraging of that more open view, because I think in the culture that we have, people are probably not going to reduce themselves to Ayn Rand's philosophy in the same way that they might be open to the idea of living longer and the idea of technology being good and calling themselves transhumanists. I think that's more likely to come about than everybody turns into an objectivist.
Yes, indeed. And I realized even as far back as, say, 2006, that we're not going to get even 10% of the society to explicitly consider themselves to be objectivists, but I do still hold out hope for the term transhumanism, and I'm going to keep working on making it mainstream and dispelling common misconceptions about it, which are, of course, all too prevalent. Spatiality writes, I think of transhumanism as a transition to future humans, and she also writes, Gennady's promotion of transhumanism makes us all look better to mainstream media. So thank you very much for those comments, spatiality. And Jason Geringer also writes, it's a bit of a fine line between getting attention to the movement and the shock jock effect. And yes, this is definitely a fine line that we have to walk. And he also writes, consistency is important for an organization's respect. And this is, of course, one of the outcomes of having an organization persist for a long time. Later on this year, on October 7th of this year, we are going to have our 10-year anniversary as the US Transhumanist Party. And there's certainly a lot of history now, a lot of precedent in terms of our platform positions and our activities that we should respect and we should reference in our communications. And that may, to some people, be a bit more mundane or a bit more boring, but it is absolutely important because we do stand for something, and we stand for some very particular ideas and proposals as well. We are open to evolving. We are a big tent, as I've also said, but we need to be mindful, of course, of accurately representing transhumanism as well. Daniel Tweed writes, the active doer deserves all the kudos due for not being a passive criticizer. And this is, I think, a very apt point. It's one reason why I defended Zoltan during the time of his campaign, because he was actually out there doing something with the Immortality bus campaign, with attracting media attention. And we as transhumanists should continue to do something. We should continue to be actively involved in a variety of projects and conversations. Again, this outward focus, building up the movement and making sure that we do more than just say, oh, this doesn't work or that doesn't work. Let's do something that does work, or at least try something that might work. And Luis Arroyo writes, building the movement seems more important than random headlines that may help or hurt transhumanism. So the benefit of having a movement that operates effectively within itself and also has some good, capable people who are dedicated to it and are able to work on many projects simultaneously. Mike Lazine points out, well, Zoltan is a journalist, right? Therefore, he might want the headline-grabbing mindset because of his own experiences. And I have actually asked Zoltan before, well, what tips can you give for interacting with the media, for maximizing media reach? and he didn't really have any specific advice to offer. He even said that in those words. I think it's because this may be so familiar to him that he doesn't really have much experience with communicating that skill set to people who don't have it already. And I found that to be true actually with people who are very capable in a lot of respects. If it seems like second nature to them, they might not really be aware of how different other people's frames of mind are. So Zoltan is a journalist. He has this ecosystem of journalists that he deals with, and other people would not. So he might think this is just matter of course to communicate with journalists the way he does, but most people don't have either his connections or his prior experience in doing that. Now, I wonder, Ben, if Zoltan has shared any of his insights about the media and how he has engaged with them, what has worked for him, what hasn't worked for him, because again, some of your conversations may be more recent than mine.
Sure. Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in what you said. It's kind of second nature to Zoltan because of how he's grown up in the media ecosystem. He obviously had his start as a journalist working for National Geographic, in the early 2000s, and grew up from there in a media ecosystem, had developed contacts, knew how to speak to media, I guess. He's also, and I think why he gets media attention where it might be hard for other people, he's a particularly unique personality. He has a charisma, I think everyone would acknowledge. He speaks very well. He's very articulate. He also exudes that sort of plausibly presidential aura. I think Mark O'Connell put it in his book, To Be a Machine. So he has a natural charisma. He has contacts in the media. He also has a very interesting life story, which is told in my upcoming book, Transhuman Citizen, where he just had all these amazing experiences, which I think continues to pay dividends in terms of media wanting to speak to him, like sailing around the world for 7 years, like starting his own business, basically rebuilding homes, flipping houses. He did that for 3 years and made a couple of $1 million and never had to work again, which also freed him up financially to have the time to just respond to media requests quickly and things like that. So there are particular aspects to who he is as a person, which give him distinct advantages, which are hard for anybody else to have. And so I think that's maybe why it's hard for him to pass on advice, qua advice. And it's interesting because it's something we're sort of addressing right now in terms of the promotion of my book, Transhuman Citizen, and Zoltan's out there trying to get media. And the reality is he's going to get a lot more media than me, probably. That's fine for me. It all works out in terms of publicity for the book. But I can't be Zoltan. Like, I can't be the super interesting guy who's had this incredible history in all these different arenas. So it's fine if that's what he wants to do, and it works to my advantage to promote the book. But in terms of advice or analogies that he could maybe relay from his own experience that would be applicable to somebody else who's trying to advocate for transhumanism, I think that's very hard, because that is, like we've said, he is a unique personality. And so he gets attention in a way that I think is hard for others.
Yes, indeed. So one way to get more media attention is to be more of a unique and distinctive personality. And it's interesting because in everyday life, in the circles of people whom one would meet in just regular human interactions, I think I stand out quite a bit, and other people think that as well. However, I think because we live in a media ecosystem that has become increasingly sensationalized and increasingly focused on the extremes of the extremes, somebody like me, I would say, would still be perceived as too conventional to be covered in that way, to be generating headlines. I'm different, but I'm not that different. on the other hand, Zoltan with his sailboat trip through the Pacific Ocean into East Asia, with his books and his essentially nomadic lifestyle. And then he did all of this high-risk reporting for National Geographic. He did essentially a stint for a wildlife conservation organization. He did volcano boarding. He pioneered that sport. So he's definitely somebody who, at least in his earlier life, was very much attracted to extreme risk taking. And I am not, by the way, for anybody who knows me. Perhaps, if anything, I may be extreme for this society in the extent of my risk aversion sometimes, but that too does not generate very many headlines. So one has to be, I agree with you, Ben, a certain kind of person to attract media headlines that are of a sheer personal nature. And I don't think any of the other leading figures within the transhumanist movement are quite approaching Zoltan in this respect. So if we want to get media attention, it won't be because of the sheer force of our personalities. Now, I think we're interesting people and we have unique ideas and insights and skills to offer the world. But again, we're not going to win sensationalist popularity contests. So we need to distinguish ourselves in other ways, though Jason Geringer does say he wants to surf on lava. Well, I don't know. I mean, you have to have an active volcano, Jason. So you have to time it just right to not get hit by chunks of molten rock as you descend. So I think we're all perhaps a bit past the point in our lives where we could even realistically do that. The riskiest thing I do other than driving my vehicle is trail running. But of course, trail running is a very commonplace activity now. And Jason, yes, I know you're just kidding. But anyway, very good points about media exposure. And now I think it's a good time to get some questions from Art Ramon and Daniel. So Art Ramon, please go ahead.
One of the things I've noticed from the book Atlas Shrugged and was it the Jethro Knight? I forget the name. Sorry, I'm blanking out. Zoltan's book. They both seem to have breakaway societies. There you go, transhumanist wager. They both have breakaway civilizations in them. And, recent whistleblowers say there's probably some sort of secret program to the DOD, reverse engineering UFOs, and almost implying, it's been implied for a while in the conspiracy circles that there is some sort of breakaway civilization. And I know a while back there was this anti-gravity researcher, Ning Li? She made some discovery in anti-gravity and then disappeared or died. A very real John Galt type moment. And I was like, what are your thoughts on there actually being some sort of breakaway civilization that exists right now, and us commoners aren't part of it, and these guys are just ready to sort of zoom out of here when a big Apophis asteroid comes and hits the planet? What are your thoughts? I mean, could have Ayn Rand heard of something back in her time, murmurs of an actual breakaway civilization, and she decided to just turn it into some fictional story? And maybe even Zoltan, with his connections in the media, could he have heard of something similar of an actual breakaway civilization? What are your thoughts?
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's such an interesting question, right? I think in terms of Rand, I don't know, and I've obviously studied her career quite a bit, but I haven't heard that she had heard of any particular breakaway civilization. But in terms of fiction, it's a very common trope. And I think she was inspired by hidden valleys as they're found in a lot of stories and a lot of pieces of fiction throughout history. And it's interesting then, because this is another arena in which Rand, putting this in her fiction, has actually inspired a lot of people in real life to want to try something like this. And there are a lot of examples of people trying to establish a breakaway civilization like Galt's Gulch, as found in Atlas Shrugged. There was a commune in Chile called Galt's Gulch, Chile, I think set up maybe 10 years ago. And people want to found a place upon planet Earth where there are no other governments, where there, can be greater personal freedoms. I think a lot of people now are trying things like that. Even Akon, right? Akon's trying his own city in Ghana. There are various examples of libertarian communities being set up or being attempted to set up. There's Prospera in Honduras. There's Liberland in Europe. So it's something that people are always trying. Seasteading, obviously, is a movement which is trying something like that. Zoltan himself is an ambassador for the Seasteading Institute. And this is the idea of building a floating platform on the ocean, right, where you would be free potentially of government interference if you built it on international waters. And this is exactly how it's done in the Transhumanist Wager, how Jethro sets up his alternative society. His version of Galt's Gulch is not a valley in the mountains the way it is in Rand. It's a floating platform upon the ocean. So there's no conspiracy about it in a lot of ways. There's a lot of very open movements out there trying to secede from other nations and trying to create an alternative civilization. The question is it going to work? And I think the jury's out on that. Even Prospera, had certain aspects of its charter revoked. The Honduran government took back a lot of the powers that it had sort of granted in terms of immunity or sovereignty over Prospera. It revoked those particular aspects of its sovereignty. And the problem is, which Zoltan did get right in terms of how he describes it in the Transhumanist Wager. The problem is, once these breakaway societies start being successful, existing governments will want a piece of their success, right? So they're just not going to give up that power. And actually, it's an interesting question in terms of the Ayn Rand Institute, would be referenced several times. I also heard on one of Yaron Brook's podcasts, he was asked a question, did the Ayn Rand Institute ever try and set up something like Galt's Gulch? And apparently they did look quite a bit into it, particularly in the 1990s, but they came to the conclusion that in order for a libertarian breakaway society to be successful, you would first have to develop a nuclear weapon, because then people would leave you alone. And without that, people weren't going to leave you alone. So it's very interesting.
Yes, it is absolutely interesting. Go ahead, Art Ramon.
No, I was just saying thank you.
Yes, of course. And we have had some discussions on the subject of seasteading with Michael Elliott, who had, or maybe still has, a startup called Ventive Float House, where he was actually trying to design practical seasteads. And of course, there is Vitalia City, which is still in existence. It is on the territory of Prospera, and it is true that the new government in Honduras has threatened the legitimacy of Prospera since 2022, but apparently the people behind Prospera are challenging that in court, and Prospera still exists. But Vitalia City is an explicitly longevity-oriented community, and people go there, they reside there for extended periods of time, they have various meetings and presentations. So I think it's quite a promising concept to have this approach where people get together in a community and focus on transhumanist aspirations. How independent can it be from existing governments? That is, of course, the challenge of our time. I think there has to be reached some sort of at least acquiescence of existing governments to these kinds of communities. And I think it may be possible to achieve, but regime uncertainty is always going to be a concern. And it is certainly a concern with Vitalia right now. I just hope that they can get past whatever challenges the Honduran government is imposing on them, and also look for other jurisdictions that might be friendlier. Now, Daniel, please go ahead with your question.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up that buoyant line of seasteading for a bit, because my friend Francois Junot, who I noticed was here earlier, he has a proposal called Tuvalu 51. You may know Tuvalu is the island that's going underwater, and the 51 refers to his idea that it should become a 51st state of the United States, because I think it is true that until you get a nuclear capable power to give their blessing on some kind of oceanic habitat venture, that it's probably going to be problematic. Art and I have discussed this. Our proposal with the Gigacarbon X Prize was an idea for a belt of floating marinas at the equator where the water is calmest and the solar influx is at peak. And also you get the best boost for orbital payloads. There's spaceports. The Indian spaceport's about 6 degrees off the equator. There's French Guyana spaceport virtually on the equator. And indeed, in the book, The Millennial Project, Colonizing the Galaxy in 8 Easy Steps by Marshall Savage, he sees the seas as a precursor to large-scale human habitation off-world. Yeah, I think it's great to have a guy like Zoltan in our stable that has lived on the seas and is an ambassador, like Gennady pointed out. So what would you agree with that idea that it's not going to be viable until it gets the sanction of a nuclear armed country?
Yes. Yes, I definitely think so. I agree with you on that, and I agree with Gennady when he says that these things are absolutely worth trying. Even Silicon Valley was kind of a startup community in its own way, right? And I think there is such validity in people who have the same values, who have particular skills in particular areas coming together and trying to advance the culture and trying to advance science. In terms of whether that can break away and be its own nation or be another state or something like that, again, that's a much more open question, and I think a much more difficult question. And I think it is very hard for any new nation to come about in today's world that wouldn't have the explicit protection of another state, like the US or something like that. So in terms of absolute sovereignty, I think that is very challenging, but that doesn't mean there can't be some halfway house where we actually get very innovative, very progressive communities that accomplish a lot. And I think those things are worth trying, as long as we know and understand that creating a whole new nation that might have absolute sovereignty and might, therefore change the world from that standpoint, that's going to be a lot harder.
What do you think about the Free State Project? I hear they've got about 22 of the New Hampshire legislative seats so far. That's the idea, live free or die, move to the Granite State, take over it, and make it a libertarian state. Do you see that as a kind of a seasteading light option?
Yeah, it's interesting. That probably has more, is more analogous with Galt's Gulch in the traditional sense. I think ultimately what we want is a world that is more free, not tiny communities hidden away somewhere. And that maybe is a more challenging thing. But for example, people often give out about the European Union, and it's, it has a lot of problems. It's a huge bureaucracy and all the rest of it. But what it has given people is free movement, the right to live and work anywhere across 27 countries. And that's huge. And that's a lot of freedom given to a lot of people. And I think we want more of those freedoms from my point of view. The answer is not necessarily to hide away in some small part of the world. You can move somewhere right now that's going to be more free. I was just down in the Dominican Republic for my day job, and I met a bunch of Canadians there who were very excited that they didn't have to wear seatbelts, you know, and could honk their horn whenever they wanted. In the Dominican Republic, they could enjoy more freedom. That you can travel in the flatbed of a truck, which is illegal in Canada, right? So you can move to parts of the world right now where you can have more freedoms on an individual level and on a personal level. And I think that's totally valid to do, to want more personal individual freedom in your own life. But I think what we also want is to change the world and change the culture and open up societies generally, not shrink from the world. That would be my view.
Yeah, I think freedom of movement is the most neglected of human rights. So, great answer.
Yes, indeed. And this is a great conversation. One other endeavor that I will highlight is called Atlas Island, and we had a virtual Enlightenment Salon with William Otey about it on September 19th, 2021. So he is the author of a book called The Micronation Revolution, and the Atlas Island is a proposed seastead-based nation based on the principles of individual rights and liberty. As far as I'm aware, it is still an active project. It still has a website, but I have to check in with him to see what has happened in the ensuing 2.5 years. But all of this is quite relevant to Zoltan's writing, in particular the Transhumanist Wager, because, of course, the seastead nation of transhumania features prominently in it, and it is Jethro Knight's vehicle for essentially taking over the world. And the premise is, once transhumania is established, initially Jethro Knights does not want to take over the world. He just wants to peacefully develop transhumanist technologies and invite the leading scientists, anybody who can help this movement. But the other nations of the world unite in an attack on transhumania, and this triggers a world war, and the transhumanists win the world war and essentially take over the world that way. But they, unfortunately, in my view, inflict mass destruction upon the infrastructure of existing societies, including the destruction of cultural and religious monuments. And this was where I really departed from Jethro Knights when I read the book, because I think that's completely counterproductive and the opposite frame of mind that a transhumanist would take. I would think a transhumanist would want to integrate all of the achievements of human civilization into something greater and better, but would not destroy anything that took a great deal of effort and thought and creativity. But this notion in the Transhumanist Wager that if a breakaway transhumanist society is created and it is seen as actually being promising and powerful, the other nations of the world will unite against it. What do you think about that? Do you think that is a likely or even inevitable outcome of that kind of development? Or do you think it's possible through some pathway to create transhumanist societies, whether or not they're independent from existing jurisdictions, and have the outcome be peaceful? Just like, of course, there are various countries in the world today. Most of them are not at war with most other countries, so there's some sort of peaceful coexistence happening most of the time. But what do you think the future of explicitly transhumanist societies, especially ones that really have a chance of working, might be?
Sure. Yeah, it's such a difficult question. And as you say, and as we talked about before, I think the way that Zoltan portrays it in his novel is one potential way it could come about, and a very scary one. Whether in real life, you'll see enough people make enough of an effort to drop out of the existing world and start their own society and develop it to such an extent that it can not only defend itself, but actually win a war against the rest of the world, including the United States and China. That certainly sounds far-fetched and within the realm of science fiction. I think even if you talk to people today, even in my own conversations with Zoltan, lots of people get excited about starting a new Gold's Gulch like we've just talked about, or dropping out of the world and starting all over again, like that's really hard, even if your taxes are going up to such an extent that it's very painful, even if the regulations really are strangling you. Where do you begin? How would you do that? It means giving up so much of your existing life, and you need like hundreds and thousands of people to do that, to start something like Gold's Gulch or Transhumania. And I think that is still probably unlikely where we stand now. Where I see transhuman societies, transhumanist societies growing from here, I really think it is linked with a broader libertarian small L agenda in terms of the breakdown of things like trade barriers, the breakdown of restrictions on free movement of people. I think the success for a transhumanist future will come about when it brings along enough of the planet with it, that enough people are invested in this idea of the future that they feel like it's a place for them, right? And I talk a little bit about this at the end of Transhuman Citizen, the book. You look at the development of a technology like IVF, which I know is kind of in the news again in the States right now. At least until very recently, that was a kind of a no-brainer after decades of having been criticized and attacked, and it was Frankenstein, and it was, playing God with babies. But once people saw the benefits in their own lives, once people saw that, they could have children when they couldn't before, of course they wanted that. And I think so many transhumanist technologies are like that. Even if we think it's crazy that you might chop off your arm and get a robotic one, when people start doing that, and it seems to be better than what we have now, people are going to want to jump on that bandwagon. When people start living on the moon, initially we're going to think they're crazy, and why would you do that? But when they start thriving, people are going to realize that, okay, maybe I can live a different kind of life. Maybe I can have other opportunities there that I can't right now. And philosophically, it's something I deal with in my day job. So I'm the managing editor of a newsletter called the Global Intelligence Letter. And on Sundays, we publish some essays by a commentator you may or may not know, Bill Bonner. But he talks about, when societies are on the way up, they want to compete. They want to be free. They want openness. They want no regulation. They want low taxes. They want to compete on the world stage. When societies are on the way down, they want to erect trade barriers. They want to block immigrants. They want to shut down things and keep things in the status quo. They want to keep things as they are. And to me, a transhumanist future is about all the possibilities of what humanity can be. It's about living on the moon. It's about having bodies that don't have to suffer with things like Fanconi anemia that I had. It's about so many options in your life that you never had before. And it's only if we align ourselves with an agenda which broadly speaks to the potentiality of humanity, more broadly speaks to human potential, that I think we can succeed. And I think that, like I've said, involves being aligned also with openness, more broadly, politically and philosophically, openness to each other, openness to free movement of people, openness to borders, openness to new technologies. To me, it all goes together in terms of an outlook on life. And in terms of how we achieve a transhumanist future, I don't think you can have one without the other. I don't think you can shrink from the world and move off into a little corner and develop your own little thing. I think it's been shown that that is too hard to do. I think you have to have the hard conversation in every polity on the planet and advocate for openness and advocate for new technologies and advocate for capitalism as something that is successful and creative and moral. I think that's much harder in some ways, but I think that's the only way it's going to happen.
Yes, and I definitely appreciate those insights. And I think your comment about the differences between societies that are ascendant and societies that are on the way down, and how the former are quite open to innovation and the latter try to clamp down and engage in protectionist measures. That is truly on point. And I also agree with you that transhumanism needs to be inclusive and needs to make the case to as many people as possible that it stands to improve their lives. So a lot of people within the transhumanist movement are actually quite emphatic about this, that the technologies that transhumanists advocate are not just going to be for a small elite, that they are going to be made available to the vast majority of people, to as many people as want them. And we should strive actively to achieve that outcome so that ordinary people will have access to life-extending medical therapies, whether they have a rare disease as you do, Ben, or whether, like all of us, they suffer from the ravages of aging and they want to do something about it. They should have access to those treatments. And I do think there are so many misconceptions that transhumanism is just for a small elite, even though I can assure you in the Transhumanist Party, we do not have these kinds of wealthy elite backers. Sometimes I wish we had that magnitude of support because we could do a lot of good with it. But the fact is, transhumanism right now is essentially a middle-class movement, and it is likely to stay that way for the foreseeable future. But even say with seasteading, there have been backlashes. There was the floating city project in French Polynesia, and you can read about it on the Seasteading Institute website, where there was an attempt to cooperate with the local government and create seasteads. They wouldn't be independent, but they would bring commerce to the area. They would bring more investment, and all that the seasteaders really wanted was permission to build them and the agreement that the local government would not interfere with their operations. And yet there was such a backlash. And again, that government was replaced with a more populist government. And there were accusations that this is just a new form of colonialism. And to this point, Jason asks a question: what if people start saying that seasteading is imperialistic and it is, quote, colonizing the sea? It's kind of a joke, but almost not. And indeed, I am not surprised by such sentiments anymore, even though, in my view, they are patently absurd because, yes, you might be colonizing the seas, but you're not subjugating any humans. It's like space colonization. You're not subjugating any humans if you settle a barren world and you terraform it and you make it habitable. You are just adding new space for human habitation, and you're not discriminating against humans who want to be involved based on all of the historical attributes for which people were discriminated against. You could be perfectly inclusive and welcoming and colonize the seas or colonize space. So do you have any insights as to how we could overcome those kinds of attitudes? Because I think this kind of left-wing populism could be antithetical to the progress of transhumanism and could pose some obstacles to getting transhumanist projects realized.
Yeah, I think it's very, very hard. And I think we're in a moment culturally where it's particularly hard, as you kind of alluded to. Like in some ways, you know, the late 90s after the Cold War was a very rich environment for futurist ideas and thinking we were all going to live in space and all the rest of it. And you know, maybe particularly since 2008, people's concerns are more down to earth, maybe. And politics has changed in the US, it's changed in Europe. People are less open maybe to different ideas about the future. A lot of people want to, you know, maybe on the right, people are more interested in preserving the status quo and what they have in their own lives. And maybe on the left, people are more interested in, you know, a different kind of change, like that decolonization that was referenced and these sorts of ideas. So we're in a moment culturally where neither the left nor the right is kind of progressive in what I would consider to be the right way, which is open to transhumanist ideas. And I think, like I said, in many ways, maybe the hard work needs to be done in terms of persuading the culture of first the benefits of things like free trade and, you know, untaxed companies. And I think unless you go back that far and are able to persuade enough people of that agenda, and maybe within that, you can make the argument, of course, that, you know, your kids will live longer. We can live in a world that's cancer free. Like, how amazing would that be? If you relate it to people's lives, I think that can certainly be part of it. And like I said about IVF, you know, there are certain aspects of the transhumanist agenda, if you want to call it that, which are no-brainers in terms of how people would want to live their lives. And this actually came up in the context of when I was writing the book in relation to my illness, Fanconi anemia as well. There was a case in the early 2000s of a couple who used embryo selection to select a bone marrow donor who would be a sibling who would be a bone marrow donor for their daughter who had Fanconi anemia. So they used embryo selection to basically ensure that they had another child who A, would not have Fanconi anemia, and B, would be a donor to Molly, their existing daughter, who was very ill at the time and needed a bone marrow transplant. And of course, this created a massive backlash in the media in terms of, oh, again, you're playing God, you know, you shouldn't be selecting embryos, you shouldn't be discarding the embryos that were discarded. But of course, to, you know, Molly Nash, the girl in question, and her parents, it was a no-brainer that if you have the opportunity to save your daughter and to have another child, which you want another child, of course you do those things. Of course you save your daughter. And of course, you know, if this is the only way to do it, you do it. And everybody standing outside of that scenario is like thinking about it in terms of these philosophical issues, right and wrong. But when you're in that scenario, I think the right thing to do often becomes abundantly clear. And I think that was a case where the Nashes were in the right. IVF is a case where people who want to have more kids are in the right, and the public in general gets why these are important things in their own lives. And I think if transhumanism can make the argument about longer lives in the context of things like that, which are clear to people, cancer vaccines, things like that, maybe that's a way to advance the argument. And I think you can't have the conversation about cancer vaccines and those things being important in terms of the future without having the broader conversation about what kind of society do we want to live in? We want to live in a society where companies can create these things, where there aren't, you know, the regulations that strangle innovation. We want to live in a society where we are optimistic about the future. So the question was, how do we maybe bring these ideas home to people in a way that makes them real? And I think you do have to talk about their lives and meet them where they are. And I think there is a way to do that, but I think it is very, very difficult because there are so many other issues in the culture which are currently occupying people's minds.
Yes, thank you. And I agree with you that pointing out how certain existing technologies that are not controversial, or at least not controversial among most people, are in essence transhumanist technologies, and they can be used to save people's lives or give people options they wouldn't have had otherwise, is extremely important. And IVF is a very good example of that. It's quite bizarre to me that now there are starting to be challenges to it again. And my interpretation is most of those challenges stem from misunderstandings or idiosyncrasies in some of the legal cases that have been put forward. And I definitely hope that IVF is going to continue to be a widespread option for as many people as want to utilize it. Mike Lazine writes that Ben is making good points. Wait and see what people will say if we can get ectogenesis as a doable technology. And this is yet another example. So people who today, for instance, can't conceive children, but they want to have children, could be greatly empowered by artificial wombs, by ectogenesis. And this could also be, in my view and the view of the Transhumanist Party, a solution to the abortion debate, which is otherwise quite intractable. You could have these fetuses incubated in artificial wombs, and then the termination of a pregnancy does not mean the end of the life of the fetus. But I'm sure there will be reactionaries on both the left and the right against these technologies. I'm sure we'll hear arguments from the right that, oh, this is playing God, or from the left that this is unnatural, that this is somehow elitist, and we need to overcome that resistance. John H. has a great suggested phrase: we transhumanize in peace for all mankind, or words to that effect. So thank you very much, John H., for that. And we have about 5 minutes remaining in our salon. And we talked about the culture changing. We talked about the media changing, people's outlooks changing. I wonder, Ben, if you could provide some insight into perhaps how Zoltan's own thinking has changed and evolved since he departed the leadership of the Transhumanist Party, and in what directions he has developed since that time. Of course, we're aware of some key events in his life. For instance, he ran for governor of California in 2018. He challenged Trump for the US presidency in 2020. Now he has a vineyard that he owns, and he's selling a wine branded as the Transhumanist Wager with an Immortality bus graphic. But how has Zoltan's thinking evolved in your impression, Ben?
Sure. I would say that the essence of his thinking hasn't changed at all. His essential goal in life is still the same. It is to live forever, and it is to make that possibility available to everyone. How he goes about it, I think he spends a lot of time wondering what the next possible step could be or should be. I know he actively contemplates running for office again. Maybe running for office outside of the US. He is entitled to European Union citizenship. I don't know if he's got it yet, but he's certainly spoken about that possibility. Maybe running for office outside the US, which I think would be very interesting. He's still very interested in politics. He also is interested, as ever, in everything else, the media landscape, and writing articles and speaking and advocating. I think he spends a lot of time wondering how he makes the goal that he's seeking, how he will make that a reality, because it gets more pressing as each year goes by, right? We're all closer to the grave. And if we want to stave off that moment, it becomes harder. Politically, I think he remains a very interesting figure. I had some interesting conversations in the course of writing the book with Zoltan's campaign manager in 2020, Pratik Shugul, who also worked for, I think, Mike Huckabee and for Donald Trump at one point. And he described Zoltan as a very open-minded political thinker, which I think is true. Zoltan has goals that he wants everyone to have, longevity, living forever, transhumanist outcomes, but he's very flexible in terms of how we get to that point. And I think he's always considering what is the best way to advocate for that and to achieve that. I also think he can vacillate back and forth between being more libertarian or less libertarian. There's a conversation, a sequence in the book, which if anybody picks it up, they'll read about he had a certain health scare at one point in his life, and just immediately prior to the health scare, he was, very much advocating for more free market policies, for instance. And post the health scare, he'd actually had some treatment in Europe, and he was shocked that the cost of the medical care was like a third for just as good service as what he was getting back in the States. And he had become more, quote unquote, compassionate in terms of thinking about how we advocate for a change in the healthcare system in the US that wouldn't make people bankrupt and things like that. So I think his own experience of the world is constantly feeding into how he thinks about politics and how he thinks about advocacy. And broadly speaking, I think that's a good thing. I think that's a good trait for a person, a politician, to have. Some might criticize Zoltan's vacillations and say he, just blows with the wind, and whatever happens, he's willing basically to say anything to be elected. But I don't think it's quite like that. I think he is open to the world and open to being persuaded and open to changing his mind depending on who he speaks to and what happens in his life. And I think, broadly speaking, that's probably what we want from our leaders.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Ben, for that assessment. And I think we're all quite curious to see what Zoltan will do next. He has always been an independent thinker and certainly an original thinker, definitely receptive to new ideas and to the evolution of his own thinking. So I can't predict what he's going to do, but he is one of those interesting figures who is worth following and definitely worth reading about and analyzing, as you have done. So I would encourage everyone to purchase Transhuman Citizen, Zoltan Istvan's Hunt for Immortality. It will be out on July 1st, 2024. You can pre-order it on Amazon, and we share the same goals as Zoltan does, ultimately, to live long and prosper.